January 17th, 1997. I'm in my flat in Amman. It's freezing outside today. In fact, they predicted snow. There is snow at about 1,000 meters, but Amman's only at 750 meters, so there's no snow yet today. My landlord doesn't turn the heat on till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so I've taken all of my Egypt stuff back to bed with me, and I'm going to spend the day making this tape. I will be talking about a trip that I made to Egypt from November 27th to December 6th. We spent 4 days in Cairo and 6 days in Luxor and Aswan in Upper Egypt. The Nile River flows north towards the Mediterranean, so the southern part of Egypt is called Upper Egypt, while Cairo and the Mediterranean is Lower Egypt. I went with 3 other people, another teacher, Sandra, from the American Language Center where I'm working. She's about 26. Her brother, Brad, who's about 23, came from the States. And with us was a Jordanian friend, Sandra's neighbor, named Ehab. Ehab was able to arrange a very good arrangement deal for us on the tickets, the flight. And then the first couple of days in Cairo, where we got settled, Ehab did a lot of translating for us as we got things sorted out. If you're interested in a history of Egypt, you're going to have to go buy a book. There's not enough time really to cover it in this short tape. I'll only make reference to those specific points that are relevant to places that we visited, things that I'll comment on the tape. The history of Egypt under the pharaohs is well known in the West, but the Islamic history, in fact, is less well known, and there is a point here that I'd like to add on the tape. I'll go back to a Arab soldier named Saladin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in Arabic as Salah al-Din. He was a Sunni Muslim born in 1138. He actually was a Kurd from Armenia, and he learned soldiering in the court of Damascus. In 1177, he began jihad, or a holy war, against the Crusaders who had overrun the Middle East, including Cairo, and eventually expelled them from the whole of the Middle East. This was the beginning, really, of Islamic, the main era of prominence of Islamic Cairo, of which a lot of the most interesting parts of Cairo date from this period. Saladin was not a caliph or a secular sultan of over Cairo, but rather a military leader, and he eventually was overthrown by a group called the Ayyubids, and they then were eventually replaced by a group called the Abbasids. Each of these two, the Ubayyids and the Abbasids, made one fatal error of depending on foreign troops and bodyguards. So when they became weak, their bodyguards overthrew them. With the Abbasids, their bodyguards were from a group called the Mamluks. The Mamluks were actually quite an interesting group. They were a self-perpetuating caste of slave warriors. They were originally stolen, really, from Central Asia, but later were drawn from all over the Near East and the Balkans. Their price in the slave market reflected the value of their ethnic stock. So a Tartar from Central Asia was worth proportionally more than a Circassian, and a Tartar and a Circassian were worth double what a Slav or an Albanian was worth on the slave market. And of course there were qualities like their sturdiness and their beauty, handsome young men. These were only men. They were kept in barracks in Cairo, and often the children were born of concubines who were provided for these slaves. The Mamluks advanced through their ranks under an Amir. Amir is Arabic for prince. And these Amirs sodomized them and lavished gifts upon their favorites. With the support of the right Amir, a ruthless Mamluk could aspire to actually becoming a sultan. Because of the frequent changes of rulers, it was easy for a Mamluk to move through the ranks and eventually actually become ruler. The Mamluks ruled Cairo from around 1250 through 1517. And in fact, during this period, Cairo rose to its actually greatest period since the pharaohs. While they were really a bloodthirsty lot, very military, very lots of wars and so on, they built, in fact, some of the most aesthetically beautiful mosques and mansions around Islamic Cairo. In spite of their constant bloody conflicts, the city maintained civilized institutions like public hospitals and libraries and schools. And in fact, at one point after the sacking of Baghdad, Cairo, in fact, had no peer in the Islamic world. And it was the inspiration for many of the stories of the Arab tales, which are called 1001 Nights in Arabic, known in English as Arabian Nights. About 1570, the Ottoman Turks had reduced Egypt to from an independent state really to a vassal of their vast empire, and the Mamluks were no more than overseers of the Ottoman Empire. And this continued until the French and the British arrived when Napoleon extended the Napoleonic Wars to the Middle East and Egypt. An 18th century traveler to Cairo was struck by, and I quote, the squalid wretchedness of Arabs. And there were about, at that point, maybe 350,000 inhabitants left. This was the 18th century. This continued until Ottoman servant, really, named Muhammad Ali, turned against his masters and ruthlessly overcame the Ottomans and took over total power, absolute power of Egypt. Muhammad Ali ruled from 1805 to 1848, and he did things like drain the swamps around the Nile and huge urban development projects, and in fact shifted Cairo from the Islamic to the modern city that we know now. Cairo has been the largest city in Africa and the Middle East ever since the Mongols wasted imperial Baghdad in 1258. Medieval Arabs called it Dunya, or Mother of the World, and as Great Cairo in 19th century Europeans, it was one of a half dozen super capitals, that is, capitals that are bigger in themselves than their countries as a whole. Cairo, Egyptians actually have two names for this city. One is an ancient name and one is a popular name. One is the ancient popular name and the other is the Islamic and the official name. The ancient name is Masr, M-A-S-R, which means both the capital and the land of Egypt. For Egyptians abroad, in fact, Masr refers to all of Egypt, and in Turkish it's Misr, M-I-S-R, which means Egypt, but also corn, because all of the corn in Ottoman Constantinople came from Egypt. Cairo now has a population of about 18 million people. It's very densely populated and heavily polluted. The best way to get around Cairo is by walking, because of the density of many of the places of interest. They are concentrated around a roundabout called Midan Tahrir. Driving in Cairo is a real headache. I didn't drive there, and apparently most foreigners don't, because the pedestrians really depend on the motorists' swift reactions. And in fact, motorists, if you're fast getting across the street, they will slow down and wait for you. But if you get out into the middle of the street and get confused or you hesitate, the drivers then don't know what to expect, and that's when you're more apt to get run down. The concentration of cars in Cairo makes parking a very difficult problem, which affects motor pedestrians, because the motorists park bumper to bumper along the curbs, and on the sidewalks, and they leave the handbrakes of their cars off so that the local guard who's minding their car, or whatever the district, the local area is, can push the car back and forth to make room for people to get out of their driveway, or to get the car before or after out from the parking place where they've been squeezed in. Most of the people in Cairo, the drive without their headlights on at night, which is a little bit disconcerting. Cairo is fairly well lit at night, but these masses of cars going around without their streetlights, their headlights, was quite a surprise to us. I also noticed that they don't necessarily mind the traffic lights. These traffic signals were only installed in the 1980s, and they have yet to acquire any real local credibility. Rather, the police are stationed at all the major intersections, and the motorists obey the police signals rather than what the traffic lights say. We did our traveling around Cairo on the metro, which is a very good system. It's very efficient, it's cheap, costs pennies to use it. And it covers all the main districts within Cairo. If you're going to Cairo, I certainly recommend that you get a hotel on one of the near one of the metro stops. Further out from central Cairo, the neighborhoods get cleaner and prices of hotels go up, but it's a welcome relief from the chaos of downtown Cairo. We also use taxis a lot. The taxi cabs there are black and white. Unfortunately, you have to know a major landmark where you're going, or a main thoroughfare, street, because there are so many back alleys in Cairo, and the taxi drivers don't necessarily know the names of each one of these. So you hail a taxi, argue with the driver about what the fare is going to be. The locals pay a considerably cheaper fare than tourists. They have meters, but the meters are rarely used. The fares are determined more by what the market will bear. So a local, a Cairene, which is spelled Cairene, pay considerably less than what the locals do. In fact, maybe as much as half. One of the real headaches of Cairo is the tipping that's required, the baksheesh. Everybody expects some small reward for some small service. It can be the man who pushes the button at the elevator to take you to where you're going, or someone who pushes his way and forces himself upon you as a guide in a museum when in fact you've got a guidebook in your hand. It's impossible to get away from them. Everybody expects something for just pointing out the directions to you on a street corner. Cairo is divided by two channels that run around two major islands in the Nile. One is the island of Rhoda, which is smaller than the other island, which is Gezira. And it's on this island of Gezira where we stayed in a district called Zamalek. Zamalek, Zamalek, was originally a very British neighborhood. It's greener than the rest of Cairo, and still has, because it's relatively peaceful compared with the rest of most parts of Cairo, it still is a place where people prefer to live. Renting a flat in Cairo, according to my guidebook, is the equivalent of moving into Manhattan, that it's very much an upmarket area. Most of the buildings here date from the 1930s. There are many foreign companies and embassies in this area. We stayed in a typical 1930s style hotel, which has about 4 floors of the original building, and there are 4 floors built on top of the original building, with no attempt whatsoever of integrating the architecture, as with much of Cairo. The hotel was awful. It was cheap enough. We paid 100 Egyptian dinar for a room which the 3 of us shared. Sandra and Brad and I shared a hotel room at this hotel. It amounted to about $10 a night. And Ihab, our Jordanian friend, stayed with some American friends who were living nearby. This American has got a PhD in Islamic studies and is the coordinator of an exchange program sponsored by a consortium of, it sounds like, Christian universities in the United States. And they have American students carefully chosen, come for about a 6-week session in Cairo. These students don't necessarily have to be studying anything at all related to Middle Eastern studies or Islam or anything else. They just select 20 students from the many who apply. Students who are interested in the experience. This family, his name was Rick, and his German wife's name was, I forget, Iris. Actually showed us a great deal of hospitality. They were wonderful. Iris came in their car and picked us up at the airport. They are living in one of the old villas in Zamalek, a villa that in fact, was totally destroyed. They had to completely renovate the interior and furnish it. Rick is on a 5-year contract with this consortium of universities running this program, and in fact said that he's making the equivalent of a dean's salary in the United States. Living with that much money in dollars based on the Cairo economy, they're living very comfortably. Another of the very beautiful homes, old homes in this Zamalek area that I visited, was a building that it's an ancient building. Old building. I couldn't figure out what it was originally function was. Probably, maybe an embassy, perhaps someone's villa. But it has been renovated into the Greater Cairo Public Library. Its nickname is the Mubarak Library because it was established by the current president, Hosni Mubarak. And in my wandering around through Zamalek, I came across this building, which backs up with beautiful gardens on the Nile. Our first day, we headed for the Midan Tahrir, Tahrir, which is actually the heart of modern Cairo. This is also the point of the Sadat entrance to the metro. But the streets are torn up around the huge roundabout, and this was a bit difficult getting around there. Off the Midan Tahrir is the American University in Cairo. I wandered over there myself on another trip, but this is an appropriate point to add it. It's beautiful. It's a very old campus. I couldn't find any place in my guidebook or information about it when it was established. But judging from the buildings and the history of the Middle East, I would imagine that it was originally a missionary university institution. And many of the buildings are still old, early 19th century, late 18th century buildings that have been restored. It really is an oasis out of the noise of Midan Tahrir, with lush gardens and beautiful old trees. And it was just very, very beautiful lawns and well-manicured hedges and so on. I wandered into the main administration building, which apparently I wasn't supposed to be there. We were there over Thanksgiving weekend, so everything at the university was closed. But the university itself is responsible for publishing some of the best research on Egypt in English. And the AUC itself is a Western-style haven for wealthy Egyptians and American students doing a year abroad. It also is, in the dormitories, is the home of very wealthy Arabs, students of the rich from the Gulf countries in Saudi Arabia, who have $1,000 a week allowances and exist in a pretty high life on the fast track in Cairo. The 20 American students who are attending this American studies program that EHAP's friends are in charge of also live in the dormitories, but Rick said that the wealthy Arab students have no interest in the more middle-class, mundane American students, so they actually don't rub shoulders very much. Another thing that we had to do, according to my guidebook, was that we needed to register as foreigners at a office called the Mugama, Mugama. The building itself dominates the southern end of the Midan Tahrir, and it's a concave office block that was actually a gift from the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Inside the place is just awful. It's a Kafkaesque warren of gloomy corridors and tiny little buildings. There are apparently 50,000 people a day visit the Mugama for different kinds of residence permits and visa problems. The guidebook warns about the dismalness of the building and how difficult it is to get any work done there. It also indicates that you have to display enormous patience and good humor when dealing with the Mugama, only resorting to tantrums and noisy demands as a last resort. The place is jammed. It's always jammed. You have to go very early in the morning, or 8 o'clock-ish, to avoid the crush. They have installed a new security system there, which are just tables set out on the sidewalk. The men go in through one entrance and the women go in through another. They wouldn't let me take my camera. So Brad and Sandra and I went in. Ehab did go in with us, in fact, but we found the right desk on the second floor, only to be told that foreigners didn't need to register for visas no, this is separate from the visa. They didn't need to register their location in the country anymore, that only the Israelis and certain visitors were actually required to do so. The Arabs, in fact, don't need any visas at all to travel from one Arab country to another. So when we came to the airport, Sandra and Brad and I moved very quickly through the immigration line with our passports and our American visas, whereas Ehab, with a Jordanian visa, was pulled out of the line along with all of the other Arab passports and made to wait it took probably another hour for him to clear immigration, because there were 3 of us Americans, and Iris was going to come pick us up at the airport. I stayed just around the luggage carousels waiting for Ehab to clear the immigration. In fact, at one point they turned all the lights off in the immigration lounge. There must have been probably 30 or 40 Arabs sitting in there. Because I was on a flight from Amman, Ehab had a lot of company with other Jordanians who were coming into Cairo to do business. Sandra and Brad, who is 6'5", took all of our luggage outside and went to find Iris, who was coming to meet us, so that we didn't miss her. The Arabs complain that they are not treated well by the other Arab countries when they come into the country, and I see now why. We spent most of the rest of the first day in the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities, which is just off the Meydan Tahrir. The museum is certainly of international renown. It has one of the richest collections of artifacts in the world. But there are thousands of items in crates in the basement. Apparently they've been in crates in the basement for so long that they're sinking into the soft mud of the basement. And the basement, therefore, has become an archaeology expedition in its own. They've had to jack up parts of the basement and get the crates up on some kind of planks to protect them. The museum itself is old, cold. The lighting is very pure, and there's confusing and often limited labeling of items. The main floor is organized according to kingdoms, from Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom galleries, according to different periods of history. Which was a little confusing. It was difficult to do with a guidebook because things aren't well marked. I think the only way to do that museum well is with a guide who gives you the 3-hour tour. The main point of interest in the museum is on the upper floor, which is dominated by the Tutankhamun galleries. The King Tut's treasures are splendid. They're just magnificent, including a mummy room, which displays rows and rows, racks and racks of mummies. The sarcophagus, in fact, there are some mummies that have been removed from the sarcophagi and are in glass cases. But we went to the Tutankhamun galleries fairly early, to avoid the crush. By the time we left, we were there on a weekend. By the time we left, you could hardly move in these galleries because there were so many people. Because it was a weekend, I believe must have been Saturday, the Egyptian children are brought through there, the school children, and they simply add to the chaos of the place. They're not particularly interested in the items in the display cases, but more in looking at the people. And we were accosted many times. Actually, the four of us got separated. But I was accosted, and the others said they were many times by Egyptian teenagers who just wanted to practice their English. It was a difficult place to actually absorb any of the history, although it has, every place you turn, there's something that you recognize. I decidedly skipped the King Tut exhibits traveling show when it came to San Francisco some years ago. Rather than wait a couple of hours in line there, I decided to hold out for the real thing. And I was certainly rewarded many times over. The funerary implements of the boy king Tutankhamun number about 1,700 items, and they filled dozens of rooms on the second floor of the museum. Given the brevity of his reign, which dates from 1361 to 1352 BC, the number of items in his tomb, taken from his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, is just mind-boggling. One of the reasons that these finds were so important is that the tombs of the other great pharaohs, such as Ramses and Seti, have been robbed and ransacked over many years to the point that there was nothing, little or nothing remaining. In fact, many of these tombs in the Valley of the Kings, even the Valley of the Kings in Upper Egypt, the tombs have been so defaced and the mummies separated from the sarcophagus that they've actually lost track of which mummy belonged in which tomb and which tomb belonged to which king. So to find all of King Tutankhamun's things intact, in situ, really did help Egyptologists sort out the history, and certainly helped me make some sense out of what I was to see later when we went down to Luxor and Aswan. My three traveling companions literally dragged me out of the museum after 3 hours. You could easily spend a couple of days in there sorting out what you're seeing and then looking at every case. Many things were simply dumped in a case. They were not actually displayed very artfully, considering the importance of the collection. Another museum that I went to and would certainly recommend is the Museum of Islamic Art. It was... The collection began about 1880s. The museum itself was established in 1902 in Mameluke building. Actually, it was a national library of one of the Mameluke periods. It takes about an hour to get all the way through. The interesting part about this museum is that the Sunni Muslims, of whom Saladin, whom I mentioned earlier, was one, extended the strictures, the rules of the prohibitions of the Quran against idolatry to any images of animals or humans. So they are largely absent in any Islamic art. Instead of paintings and statues, there are exquisite designs based on geometric symbols, on plant motifs, on Islamic symbolism, and Arabic calligraphy, which is a totally different aesthetic than we're familiar with in the West. In the Islamic Museum, you note that dates are given as of AH, which means after the Hijra, which was Muhammad's flight from Mecca, which is mentioned on the Ramadan tape, which I'm making. This Hijra, or AH, was the starting point of Islamic chronology, which is roughly the year 1620 AD by Western reckoning. The museum has really a very splendid collection of pottery and different forms of artwork, more practical items, including a number of pieces of buildings. Literally, the whole building, the facade or a room, has been moved to the museum to save it for antiquity. One area of interest that I visited, I went on my own one day, was in the southern section of the old city, what's called Coptic Cairo. This was also the location of a fortress-like town of Babylon, where the Holy Family is thought to have taken refuge. Because of this, it developed into the heart of Cairo's Coptic community, and there's many medieval churches here, and a superb Coptic museum, which was my destination. I got there easily enough on the metro, use the Mari Girgis metro station. It cost me 30p, which is nothing. Coptic Cairo recalls the interlude between the Pharaohic and the Islamic civilization of Egypt, Cairo particularly. While it's not a ghetto now, it's the quarter's huddle of dark churches suggests the mistrust of outsiders, according to my guidebook. In fact, the quarter has considerably been cleaned up, sanitized since the late 1970s, for tourists, basically. Most of the churches here, except the Coptic Museum, but most of the other churches, there was no admission, quite different from the old Islamic district that I went to. And I wandered around here late in the afternoon and visited. In fact, I followed some different tour groups winding through the narrow, very winding, twisting, confusing back streets to the different significant sites within this district, including a very small church called the Church of the Virgin, which has got some connection or other with Mary. Directly opposite the metro station, which is Mari Girgis, which is St. George in English, are the twin towers of the city of Babylon's Western Gate. In Trajan's day, the Nile actually came to the base of this gate and was spanned by a pontoon bridge that went across to the southern tip of Rhoda Island in the Nile. The foundations of these towers and many of the older sites in this Coptic quarter are actually well below street level now. In fact, as much as 10 meters. The word Copt, C-O-P-T, derives from the Greek word for Egypt, Aegyptos, which has been truncated into Gipt, Aegyptos in the Egyptian Arabic. Let's see, let me back up a little bit. There's a bit in my guidebook about the Copts, because they were, in fact, an important factor in the Middle East. It says, while most Egyptians are Muslim, about 10% of the population are Coptic Orthodox Christians. The Copts share a common natural culture with their Muslim compatriots, but remain acutely conscious of their separate identity. Because intercommunal marriages are extremely rare, it is often said that the Copts are purer descendants of the ancient Egyptians than the Muslims. The Copts are rarely recognizable other than by tokens of their faith, wearing a cross around their neck or tattooed on their wrists, or by first names such as Maria or Anthony or George, and Ramses also. Coptic Christianity differs from Eastern Orthodox and Roman churches over doctrine and ritual. The Coptic Orthodox Church and its Pope, chosen from among monks, are totally independent from the Vatican, which only recently agreed to disagree for the sake of ecumenical harmony. The Coptic Bible was translated from Greek about 300 AD, and it antedates the Latin version by a century. While Coptic services are conducted in Arabic, portions of the liturgy are sung in the Old Coptic language descended from ancient Egyptian, audibly prefiguring the Georgian chants of Eastern Orthodox. However, the Coptic influence goes well beyond music, for it was in Egypt that the monastic tradition, the cult of the Virgin Mary, and arguably the symbol of the cross originated. The resemblance between early Coptic crosses and the Pharaohic Ankh, A-N-K-H, has also led to some to argue that Christianity's principal symbol owes more to Egypt than to Golgotha. Now, the Pharaonic Ankh is a cross with a loop on the top of it, which was the symbol for life. Christianity reached Egypt early. Tradition holds it that St. Mark made his first convert in about 45 AD. And much of this new Christian religion appealed to Egyptians on many levels because the symbolism of the new religion fitted the old myths and images. In recent decades, the Coptic community has undergone a revival under the dynamic leadership of its current pope. The monasteries have been revitalized by a new generation of highly educated monks. Community work in churches and church attendance flourishes as never before. Undoubtedly, this Coptic solidarity often reflects alarm at rising Islamic fundamentalism. attacks on churches and Coptic students have bred tension in the Middle East. However, the fact that relatively few Muslims support bigoted racism remains a source of comfort for Egypt's 6 million Copts and 200,000 Christians of other denominations, which include Greek Orthodox, Maronite, Armenian, Catholic, Anglican, and Baptist. Now, many of the churches and basilicas and so on are located actually in this Coptic district in southern central Cairo. Some of the denominations, in fact, are known for a particular hysteria that they reach when visiting the site. And in fact, in one chapel, there was a girl on the floor who was convulsing and shrieking. She'd obviously been overcome by the ritual hysteria, and the people who were with her were trying to comfort her, to calm her. There were two other foreigners who walked in the middle of this scene when I did, and we were a bit taken aback by the scene, but having not seen such hysteria before except in the Southern Baptist churches. The district which I really enjoyed the most, but which was the most, the poorest, the dirtiest, and so on, was the Islamic Cairo. There are two central areas here. One is the Khan al-Khalili Bazaar, and the other is the Mosque of Al-Azhar, which form both the commercial and the religious heart of Islamic Cairo. The Khalili al-Khalal was named after Khalil, a master of horse, who founded a caravanserai here in 1382. It is a very busy quarter of the city, pulsing with businesses, and it has been such since the Middle Ages, except on Sundays when most of the shops are shut. Everything imaginable can be bought in in the Khan. The word Khan itself, which is spelled Khan, is by definition a place where goods are made, stored, and sold. And it also provides accommodations for travelers and merchants. So it's from the word Khan, or the district that is, that we get the word caravanserai. Caravan meaning caravan is the same in English. Sarai is from the old word meaning palace. So a caravanserai is a traveler's palace. I made several expeditions into the Khan al-Khalili, both with my friends and on my own. It is typical of all of Middle Eastern markets where merchants of like goods are all clustered in a specific area. So all of the goldsmiths are in one area, all the coppersmiths are in another area, the wooden items are all sold in another spot. Interestingly, the Mameluke sultans appointed an overseer to control the prices and the weights and the quality of goods that were sold out of this area. And these overseers were empowered to inflict actually immediate fines or corporal punishment. And in addition, he was responsible for the public morals. My guidebook says, enjoining what is right and forbidding what is wrong. A great deal of the wealth of the Mamluk period came from the caravans that traveled here from all over what was then the known world. We also visited the first night. We ducked into a cafe called Fishawi's, Fihawis, which is really just tucked into one of the alleys. It's very old plaster in the actual inside of the cafe. We sat outside on the sidewalk, which is a very narrow alley. The sidewalk is decorated with these massive gilt mirrors, many of which are cracked. This cafe has been open day and night every day of the year for over 2 centuries, and they serve the a very nice mint tea or the nargile, the water pipe you can have there. Quite interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed shopping in this area, although they're ready for the foreigners. They're quite set up for it. From there, I went to the district around the Al-Khazar Mosque, which is the mosque itself, and the adjacent university was founded in the year 970, which makes it one of, if not the oldest university in the world. For more than 1,000 years, the Al-Khazar has provided students from all over the Muslim world with free board and with an education that remains largely as it was during the classic Islamic era hundreds of years ago. This 1,000-year-old mosque has for centuries been the foremost center of Islamic intellectual life. And in fact, to this day, the ulema, ULEMA, remains the ultimate religious authority for millions of Sunni Muslims from Jakarta to Birmingham. Wherever Arabic is spoken, Cairo's cultural magnetism is felt. Every strand of Egyptian society knits and unravels within this megalopolis, which is Cairo, and more specifically within the district that surrounds the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The mosque and university have long been politically significant within the history of both Egypt and the Middle East. It was a nationalist stronghold from the 19th century onward. Al-Hazar was chosen by Nasser for his speech of defiance during the Suez invasion of 1956. When Saudi King Fahd prayed here with Mubarak in 1989, it symbolized Egypt's return to the conservative Arab fold. Yet paradoxically, many of Al-Hazar's 90,000 students revere the blind fundamentalist Sheikh Omar Abdel al-Rahman, twice officially judged in Egypt as an enemy of the state. And I believe he was convicted in the United States of being involved in the World Trade Center bombing and is now in prison. We tried to visit the mosque. It is open to visitors. Women, of course, have to be appropriately dressed, and they are provided shawls to cover their hair and shoulders. Even men are not let in shorts with bare legs. But in fact, they wanted £17 entrance fee, which is more than $6, and we turned away and left. All of the old sites within this Al-Hazar district, in fact, wanted outrageous entrance fees, which I just wasn't willing to pay since there are so many free things to see. Just as a point of reference, if and when you go to Cairo, get yourself a student ID card. If you can't get one abroad before you leave, they are easily available on the black market around the Meydan Tahrir. We were approached and people asked us if we would like to get them. They would take us upstairs into some office. The advantage is that every entrance fee is half price, which brings these outrageous entrance fees down to what is more realistic. On many of the trips and tours and museums and so on that I went on, there were people of all ages, including gray-haired old women who had student ID cards, probably those bought in Cairo itself. The district around Al-Hazar, the warren of lanes and tenements, is known as Cairo's thieves' quarters, except that now racketeering and drugs are much more important. Until 1988, the main business was hashish, which was sold from the windows or actually just laid out on the street on tables and cut. And it was smoked with impunity in various little warrens throughout the quarter. Then in December 1988, scores of corrupt officials were arrested, and they were decamped to the suburbs, leaving this local district within Cairo to the local racketeers. Some current gangs get profits from organized garbage collection and begging. Others extort money from shops or restaurants, and one gang even specializes in weddings. Families pay them to stay away rather than risk disturbances, because to hire bouncers would be a shameful admission of the family's weakness. Anyway, you get a sense of what this old Islamic district was like. I wandered through there usually with a friend. We went at night, and the place was still jumping, and found it actually very much the throbbing center of Cairo. However, my general impression of Cairo, as you may well have been able to glean, is that it's polluted, it's congested, it's filthy. Around the mosques in this Islamic district, there are people who literally live against the size of the mosques. I have never, in all my traveling through the Middle East, seen such poverty, such squalor, such filth. The children of the beggars use the little parks, central parks, which are maybe, a few trees and a little grass. The children use those as toilets. It was really disgusting. Just to add some notes here, generally, that ended our tour to Cairo, and I was quite glad to leave. In fact, one of the three, Sandra, on the third day we were in Cairo, got quite ill. She had bronchitis and woke up in the morning with 103-degree fever. So we moved her to the home of Rick and Iris Cahill, the Americans at the American program there. They were friends of Ehab, the Jordanians, and Iris was formerly a nurse, so they were very kind to take Sandra out of the miserable hotel and get her some medicine and a cleaner bed and some quiet. So she and Ehab stayed in Cairo, and Brad and I, her brother, headed off for Upper Egypt. Now, first I'd like to insert just some comments here about the influence of Egypt generally in the Arab-speaking world. Given Egypt's situation in the Arab world, it is one of the largest of the Arab countries and certainly has had a major influence on all of the Middle East for centuries. But it's also no surprise that Cairo now is the center of the Arab recording industry, particularly since its main rivals in Lebanon have collapsed. Egypt's 6 million population makes an important market to Arab music. And the amazingly high proportion of youth, something like over 30 million of Egyptians are under 25. So you can imagine that a great deal of the music is very youthful. However, there are other Egyptian musicians, in particularly Kulthum, a legendary singer from Egypt whom I've mentioned on one of my other tapes, who beginning about her career about the 1930s, had a significant impact on music in Arabic, and in fact, she, through the popularity of her music and the proliferation of it, forced Arabs to overcome their political differences, and they would flock to Cairo to her performances. Additionally, Egypt has always been long been the center, really, of the Arabic film industry. Egyptian films have a particular theme that's recognizable anywhere. They tend to be heavily melodramatic. In the end, the woman who usually is disgraced somehow, either by herself or some coincidence or misunderstanding, in the end she probably dies, either killed by herself or by her relatives. But there's a great deal of singing and drama and soap opera type of things in Egyptian music, in Egyptian soap operas and drama. Because of the plethora of Egyptian films and the fact that in most Arab countries, one of the staples of their government television programming are Egyptian movies, the Egyptian dialect of Arabic is pretty well understood throughout the Arab world, although the dialects can be incomprehensible. There also are any number of books about Egypt, certainly anything written by Naguib Mahfouz, the Nobel Prize-winning grand old man of Egyptian letters, is certainly worth reading. In addition are, of course, the popular Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile, and Lawrence Durrell's The Alexandria Quartet. Alexandria Quartet is extremely difficult, dense reading, but it's one of those books where you have to read it a couple of times, really, to understand it, and really a masterpiece. Then there's a book by Olivia Manning called The Levant Trilogy. The second half of this 6-volume blockbuster, which was actually made into a movie on BBC television, is about when the principal couple are evacuated to Egypt during the war. It's quite interesting reading if you can make your way through it. I've had a number of Egyptian colleagues and neighbors in the various places that I have lived in the Middle East, and as a group, they're not well liked by the other Arabs. That is, the educated ones. They form also the lowest of the menial laboring class, but they are hard to work with because they are very aggressive. They very aggressively stake their territory, and they are suspicious of anybody who tries to move in on it. If you make a mistake with them, they remember forever. They're very status conscious, degree conscious. I remember a friend in Saudi told me that the university he was working for, they had a guard at the gate, so when you drive in, you had to say good morning and identify yourself to the Egyptian guard. They said this Egyptian guard disappeared without explanation briefly and appeared a few months later with a master's degree in something. He'd back to Cairo and probably bought himself a master's degree, and now he was still the guard for the university. The Saudis didn't recognize his degree. But that's typical of Egypt, that they're very status conscious, very territorial, and difficult people to work with. When I was living in Bahrain, the family directly behind me, our gardens were back to back. The family directly behind me was Coptic, and her back door off the kitchen looked directly into my back door off the kitchen, as the hedge that separated our 2 yards had died at that point. They were quite friendly with me because I was Western and Christian, but they would have nothing to do whatsoever with the 4 or 5 other Egyptian Arabic Muslim families in the compound, and were generally disliked by all the Arabs because of their difficult personalities. I think based more on the fact that they were Egyptian as to the fact that they were Copts. Relative to the population of Egypt, they are currently working on a national census, the 12th in modern history, which is conducted every 10 years. The Egyptians have 60,000 field workers who are touring cities and towns and villages to get information on the numbers and the social and economic conditions of Egypt's people. They expect to reveal a population of about 60 million, which is an increase in 10 million over the last census, which was conducted in 1986. What they're trying to do is collect information to work out solutions to some of the chronic problems, such as illiteracy and unemployment. The rate of unemployment currently exceeds 20%, and overpopulation. Egyptians, particularly those in the lower economic levels, have very large families. An article that I clipped out of the Al-Ahram, an Egyptian newspaper, says that, I quote, people sometimes provide researchers with wrong information. For example, some parents, especially in the country, might not want to tell the researchers the exact number of children they have because they are afraid of the evil eye. Some families might give misleading information about the male members, possibly because some of them want to dodge military service. And tenants who rent more than one apartment in the same government don't like to admit it because it's against the law. And as most of us know, females usually don't like to reveal their real age, unquote. In any case, through television programs and the imams in the mosques, they're trying to urge people to to cooperate with these field workers and give them accurate information, because it really will lead to their advantage in the national policies that are developed to handle Egypt's massive problems. One of the statistics that I've come up with, facts actually, that's rather interesting, is that a prominent economist in Egypt has pointed out that the low labor cost per unit of output in Egypt is in fact one of the lowest in the world. The problem being that being an advantage perhaps to an economist, but a problem within the poverty and the unemployment within Egypt. They have, however, recently succeeded in reducing the rate of inflation from 20% or more to less than about 8%. Egypt actually has a fairly stable economic climate. Having discussed the economy, or lack of, I should point out from the other side that as a result of advances in improvement in Egypt's telecommunications systems, a system called GSM, Global System of Mobile Communication, the cellular telephone companies, has really done it well in Egypt. By the end of last year, there were nearly 37,000 individuals had subscribed to cellular telephone services. Mind you, at this point, it's only available within Cairo, but by the end of March this year, they are expecting to serve 70,000 subscribers, with the service covering all the way to Alexandria and further out to the environs of Cairo. The system is operated by the National Telecommunications Company, and it was manufactured and installed by a French-based telecommunications company called Alcatel Telecom, which is due to provide service to roughly 200,000 subscribers by the year 2000. Many businessmen are eager to purchase these units because they've become really standard accessories for professionals in the West and in other Arab countries like Jordan and the Gulf. They are available everywhere in Jordan, and everyone seems to have a mobile phone. On the topic of terrorism in Egypt, which in fact was a factor that kept me away from Egypt for many years, the State Supreme Security Court has recently sentenced 5 Muslim militants to death for carrying out violent attacks. Members of Al-Gama al-Islamiyah, Egypt's largest underground militant organization, have waged a 4-year campaign of violence to establish an Islamic State. They were particularly active in 1993 to 1994, attacking top government officials, police officers, foreign tourists, and Coptic Christians, and bombing banks and other establishments. More than 1,000 people, mostly police and militants, were killed in the violence. Over the past 2 years, however, the government has managed to limit Gama's violence to the southern provinces, where members of the group carry out attacks against low-ranking police officers and soldiers. They use the area's mountains and vast fields as hideouts to launch hit-and-run attacks. There was an obvious presence of police in Cairo, certainly around the touristic areas where I was going, but nothing overt. They never bothered to stop and check any of us. However, going to Upper Egypt, we discovered that it was not possible to take a bus. They don't run anymore because it's too dangerous, that all of the foreigners, in fact, are sold tickets for only one train, which has actually twice daily service from Cairo to Luxor and Aswan. And then there are the boat trips. Those have started again, although there have been some incidences with militants firing on the boats from the shores of the Nile. I forgot to mention that we went to the pyramids at Giza. Brad and I took the minibus out to the suburbs of Cairo, passing the Cairo University, which is a massive place. It was founded in 1908 as a counterweight to the traditionalist Al-Azhar, the more secular university, but is equally as political. The access to the university is controlled by the central security system, so that foreigners are not actually allowed out there to wander about. Apparently, if you have your passport, you can get on with some excuse of a seemingly legitimate purpose. When I tried to get into the Al-Azhar University, we were simply turned away. Nobody is allowed without special permission. The pyramids in Giza are in the city called Giza City. Giza's as a city actually reached its greatness during the reign of Saladin, this 13th century crusader fighter that I mentioned earlier, at which point it was described as a large and important village with fine buildings. But Giza has always been a problem of poor roads, of flooding from the Nile, swamps in the nearby regions, so that the growth of Giza only began fairly recently, about the late 1800s. And at this point, Giza's population has topped 1 million, with high-rise buildings and ugly nightclubs, and it's just really a very ugly place. The only reason to go out there is that just on the outskirts of the city, I should say the very fringes of the city, is the Giza Plateau, where the pyramids are built. The pyramids. They looked everything like I'd imagined. There were no surprises there at all, except that they were extremely big, much larger than I had realized. For millions of people around the world, the pyramids really epitomize ancient Egypt. In fact, I think no other monument in the world is so instantly recognizable. But fairly few foreigners, including myself, realize that there are over 80 pyramids spread across about 70 kilometers of desert from the outskirts of Cairo south towards more or less parallel with ancient Memphis. The deviation of the word pyramid is actually obscure. There are several different schools of thought, one finding equivalents in ancient Egyptian, another in Greeks. But whatever, the pyramid's size, pyramid's sheer antiquity is really staggering. The pyramid age began at Saqqara, which is about a 4-hour horseback ride south of Giza, very popular destination activity by tourists. In any case, pyramid age began in the 27th century BC with the Third Dynasty, when a royal architect created the first step pyramid. In fact, the design was faulty and the pyramid collapsed under its own weight. It was not until the Fourth Dynasty in roughly the 26th century that all the problems were solved and a sheer-sided true pyramid arose at Giza. For the Pyramid Age was only one episode in 3 millennia of pharaonic civilization, which reached its zenith within 200 years and was followed by a decline, so that later dynasties regarded the works of their ancestors with awe. 14 centuries after the royal tomb of the Old Kingdom were first violated by robbers, the 26th dynasty collected what remained, replaced missing bodies with surrogates, and reburied their forebears. This was the point when they got mummies and coffins and tombs mixed up, and in fact created a bit of chaos in their inaccuracy of reestablishing history. Pyramids were quite an interesting experience. Approaching on the bus, and then we got within about a 10-block walk of them on the minibus, and then had to walk. And you could see them from quite a distance. They looked like small triangles sitting out on the desert. As you get closer and closer, the gigantic mass of the structures themselves is really quite overwhelming. When we approach the gate, the district within this Giza Plateau is divided for purposes of ticketing, is divided into 4 regions. Each region requires a separate ticket at 20 pounds apiece. So you're looking at 80 pounds divided by 3 is a considerable amount of money for entrance fees. Brad and I decided, since we were young and good walkers, that we opted only for one ticket that was an entrance ticket for the whole general area. And we set out across the sand on foot and walked for 3 hours, circling and recircling the pyramids, climbing where we can, and so on, just watching the people and trying to avoid the hordes of tourists there. There are actually 9 or 10 pyramids on this particular site. The 3 main pyramids, the largest, of course, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, which is spectacular. Next to it, adjacent to it, at an angle, is the Pyramid of Chephren, and beyond that is a smaller pyramid of Mycerinus. The smaller pyramid actually is quite some distance from the other 2, and we started out there because there weren't any people over there. These 3 major pyramids have accompanying much smaller pyramids called Queen's Pyramids, making a total of 7 of them on this site. Below the Chephren Pyramid, below this, the site's actually on a hill. In front of and below the Pyramid of Chephren is the Chepren's funerary temple, which was accessible, and in the front of all of these is the Sphinx, the great statue of the Sphinx. Climbing the pyramids is forbidden now. My guidebook, in fact, tells you there's a far northeast corner, which is the least dangerous ascent, and in addition, the least monitored location. It still would be a formidable task, this climb. The entire time we were walking around there, particularly when we were on foot, it was about a 20-minute walk in uphill in the sand to the Pyramid of Mycerinus, and we were constantly confronted by camel riders trying to sell us a camel ride, or are Egyptians on a horse trying to get us to take a horseback ride. The official rates are anywhere from 5 Egyptian pounds per hour for a camel and 6 Egyptian pounds for a horse, but this has nothing to do with reality. It seems that the prices are pretty much what the market will bear, and because winter is the better tourist season in Egypt because of the heat, and Cairo and Giza, certainly winter is the only time to go out there because of the heat. There were a lot of tourists around, and we were just overwhelmed, literally, by the locals trying to sell us postcards and water and get us to take horse rides. And mind you, through this throng of people, these Egyptians on horseback are galloping, literally, tossing up the sand and endangering the tourists that are trying to wander around out of the crush of people. We opted not to buy tickets to go into either of the pyramids, into the tombs there, because I had heard before that it is stifling. The heat is terrible. And if you have any sense of claustrophobia, that you can very easily find yourself trapped in this noisy, stuffy places. So we opted against that, and instead spent a very leisurely, very, very interesting 3 hours walking around, photographing, reading our guidebooks, and simply watching the people. The one thing that did surprise me is the Sphinx. Photographed from a certain perspective, the Sphinx looks very much in proportion with the largest of the pyramids, when in fact it is much, much smaller. The Sphinx, of course, is a soft limestone outcropping that's been shaped into the figure with a lion's body and a human head. No one's quite sure at this point who actually is responsible, or what culture is responsible for carving this Sphinx. The name Sphinx was actually bestowed by the Greeks from that legendary creature that asked riddles of passerbyers and killed anyone who answered the riddle wrong. But in terms of who is actually responsible for carving this, is not quite sure. The Sphinx, the soft limestone of the Sphinx, is badly deteriorated. It was supposedly an outcropping that was left standing after the harder surrounding stone was quarried for the Great Pyramid. But beyond that, nobody's quite sure what happened, where it came from. In 1991, 2 American geologists argued that the Sphinx was at least 2,600 years older than it had been imagined, and because the bedrock was heavily weathered and eroded by water, indicating that it was probably inundated during a flood, which happened somewhere about 3000 BC. This large area of the plateau of Giza closes at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and in fact is a good time to take pictures. About maybe an hour later, there's a sound and light show given on a terrace that faces the Sphinx, with the Sphinx as the narrator. The day that we were there, the afternoon that we were there, we went fairly late in the afternoon because it had been quite a warm day. And towards late in the afternoon, there were busloads of children from the Cairo area who arrived to be turned loose by their instructors. Some teachers seemed to be making an attempt to give the children a sense of the history there. Mostly, they were just running wild amongst all these racing horses and the throng of camels that were making their way in and out of the tourists. I mean, it was very, very much an Egyptian experience. Because Sandra was too ill to travel, Brad, her brother, and I decided that we were going to head south. Neither of us particularly liked Cairo, and we were quite anxious to get rolling. We took the train from Cairo to Luxor. It's supposed to be a 9-hour trip. We took the night train, in fact, got on the train about 9 o'clock at night. The train pulled out right on time at 9:30. Traveled all night, making only 1 or 2 stops during the night, and arrived in Luxor about 8 o'clock in the morning. So rather than the 9 hours that they promised, it was more like 12 or 14 hours, at a cost of about $10 or about $12, I believe, U.S. Second-class cabin. We couldn't get in a first-class cabin. It was, as you'd expect, all the foreigners actually are shuttled or confined to this one foreigners train, although there were non-foreigners in the cars with us, a few of them. The conductor came around about 11 o'clock at night, and as he was passing through the cars, he or his assistant apparently was the one that turned the video on. So beginning at 11:30 at night, we were entertained or subjected to an Egyptian movie. The television was apparently put right over our heads, as were the speakers all the way down the aisle, so there was no way to escape it. After an hour, I was trying to doze off. They left the lights on in the car all night, too. The seats were comfortable enough. But I was sort of dozing off and on until about midnight with his movie going, blasting in my ear. At which point I felt Brad get up and move from the seat next to me, and he apparently, when the second of the two movies, the double feature, started, he went scrounging around and went out to the head of the car and found where the tape player was, and he was trying to actually take the tape player out of the wall when one of the attendants came by, and Brad told him if he didn't turn it off, Brad was simply going to smash this whole system. Mind you, as I mentioned, Brad is 6'5" and is built like a football player. So when this little Egyptian was confronted by this tired, angry American, he very readily turned the whole thing off. And in fact, we discovered later we were the only car on the whole train that didn't have the movie blasting all night. Brad, by the way, was bloody good traveling companion. We were traveling as mother and son so that we could save money and share rooms, and had a really terrific time. He'd never been out of the United States before, but he's one of those natural travelers who doesn't mind getting up too early in the morning, 3 o'clock sometimes in the morning, or missing a night's sleep or skipping a meal in order to go see something. He was good fun. We really had a good time. Anyway, we arrived in Luxor about 8 o'clock in the morning. As usual, the train station was filled with locals touting this hotel or that hotel. And I knew they'd be there, so we hadn't bothered to make any reservations. We walked about 10 minutes into downtown Luxor, following a guy who looked okay. Turned out he was an English teacher at the local high school. And settled in a rather nice, actually very nice, little, probably 3-star hotel, but certainly nicer than the more expensive and more upmarket dump that we stayed in Cairo. We slept for a few hours, having endured a really sleepless night on the train, and then set out to see Luxor. Well, all of our dislike of Egypt disappeared when we arrived in Cairo and took a look around. It's a dusty little town, actually, that's been a tourist mecca ever since the Nile cruises began calling in the 19th century to view the remains of Thebes, ancient Egypt's new kingdom capital. In fact, 85% of its economy comes from tourism, and tourists often complain about being harassed and overcharged at every turn. But in fact, we found Luxor quite civilized in relation to what we just been overwhelmed by in Cairo. Over the past 2 or 3 seasons, which would have been 1994 and 95, they had 3 very bad seasons. Tourism to Luxor suffered because of the terrorist attacks and bad publicity. But this year, which was 1996, they've had more tourists this season than they had totally in the past 2 years. So apparently tourism is increasing there again. This last year, the daily average of 2,000 entrance tickets, sometimes even more than that, was more that had been sold in the past several months to the sites of the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. So tourism is picking up a bit. Still, there were not the overwhelming masses of people that we've had to endure in Cairo. The weather was good. It was around 70 degrees, actually warmer than that when we got south, 75, maybe even 80 degrees. We were in t-shirts during the day. And it's very green and beautiful along the banks of the Nile. I should probably mention here that the Nile, in fact, is very polluted. The tap water in Egyptian towns and cities is heavily chlorinated, and it's safe to drink, but it tastes awful, and it's very hard on tender stomachs. In rural areas, they recommend not that the risk of drinking contaminated water is much higher. But as a result, most tourists, and certainly my group, stuck to bottled mineral water. We were, in fact, very concerned about getting sick in Egypt. It's got a very low level of sanitation, both in the eateries and just generally. So we were very careful. There was a warning in the guidebook, which we heard elsewhere, that we should avoid any contact whatsoever with stagnant water, which includes irrigation canals and the slow stretches of the Nile River, because they are loaded with bilharzia flukes. In fact, the warning was, don't drink or swim, walk barefoot in the mud, or even in the grass that's wet with Nile water. There's a saying in Egypt, which a kid on the bus told me when we were traveling in Cairo, that if you drink water from the Nile, you will return to Egypt. I pointed out to him that drinking water from the Nile would probably put you in the hospital, which he laughed, but it's a real serious problem. Almost every visitor to Egypt comes down with diarrhea at some stage. At the worst, they'll get some form of bacterial dysentery, which is much more, amoebic dysentery particularly, which is much harder to treat. Therefore, knowing this, we were very careful about what we ate. And in fact, in Cairo, had a couple of meals at the McDonald's, which is near the Meydan Tahrir, by the American University and the Egyptian Museum, just to be on the safe side. And then we bought food from grocery stores and fruit that we could peel, bananas and oranges and so on, and pretty much made meals of what we could buy that we knew were absolutely safe. And except for Sandra's throat infection, which she brought with her, none of us got sick, quite amazingly, but certainly it was through being very careful. At one point when we went south, Brad and I were also on antibiotics just to be sure that we didn't come down with whatever Sandra had caught. Most everything in Luxor, central Luxor, can be explored on foot. Everything seems to be within about a 15 or 20-minute walk from the railroad station. And our hotel, the Arabesque Hotel, it's called an upmarket hotel, was certainly well located. We could walk to everything. And in fact, although we paid the same amount, about $10 a head, Brad and I, Brad was able to negotiate this because the place was obviously empty. But it was same price, but definitely more comfortable, cleaner, and newer than the dump we stayed in Cairo. Around Luxor are many, many horse-drawn carriages that are actually quite fun to ride. The fares are set by the authorities, meaning the official rate is about 2 Egyptian pounds for a ride within Luxor. But in fact, as with everywhere else, the drivers charge, in fact, whatever they can get. So as we were walking around, we were constantly being approached by empty carriages, with the driver starting at actually quoting in dollars, $5, and then some, well, actually beginning more like 20, 10, $5, and sometimes Brad was able to argue them down to $2. We did take a carriage out to Karnak, which is actually it was about a 15-minute ride out there, and the carriage driver was a particularly talkative one. Brad sat up on the driver's seat, whatever that's called, with the carriage driver, and I sat like a queen back in the carriage seat in the back with the large leather awning covering me. And this driver talked incessantly in broken English, difficult to understand. Brad made numerous attempts to get the guy to stop, but the guy he had lots of questions. He would ask where we're from and what we're doing and how old we were and if there were more children. And Brad again and again asked him to please stop, let's just drive. And in fact, at one point took the guy's whip and threatened to hit him if the man didn't stop talking. So Brad, of course, the guy was asking questions and Brad would answer them, and he'd turn around to verify with me that this totally fictitious story he was making up about he and his mother traveling was actually accurate. At one point, finally, the driver asked Brad about his father and my husband. And Brad said, I don't have a father. And that was the end of the conversation. The man was absolutely stunned at Brad's straightforwardness. He turned around and looked at me and winked, and we realized that whatever he'd said certainly did the trick, and the carriage driver was quiet from then on. We started actually at walking around the Temple of Luxor, which is right in town. It's right on the river and follows along the banks of the Corniche in town, on the banks of the River Nile. The entrance to the temples itself is marked typically by two huge pylons. They were just enormous. And in front of these pylons are two colossi of Ramses the Second, and in front of those is one of two obelisks that had stood there for centuries until the French took the other of the pair to Paris, where it now stands in the Place de Concorde. Facing the temple, the pylons and the entrance to the temples, behind your back, behind you to your back, is the Avenue of the Sphinxes, which used to line the road from Luxor Temple to Karnak, which must be about 5 miles long. This Luxor Temple actually was used as the, checking my notes here, it was used as the site of the annual fertility rites built by two nobles, one Amenophis III and the other Ramses II. The two of them reigning from the year 1417 to the year 1237 BC. This, in fact, was where the wives and concubines of Amenophis lived, and was the site, apparently, of some rather ribald fertility festivals every year. As the capital of the new kingdom, an empire that stretched from Nubia in the south, which is now Sudan, to Palestine in the north, Thebes' ascendancy over the rest of the known world was certainly became the greatest in Egypt. And the sites around Luxor are certainly appropriate to the majesty and the power that was centered in the Theban kingdom, the new kingdom. Brad and I only had a day, actually a day and 2.5 days in Luxor, and unfortunately got to the temple complex of Karnak only about an hour and a half before it closed. Karnak beats every other pharaoh monument. It is on a Leviathan scale. To house the gods, it in fact was built over a period of 1,300 years by many dynasties over approximately 100 acres. And it is a hodgepodge of obelisks and temples, and at its zenith, Karnak drew tribute from 65 towns and cities, owned vast estates and scores of ships. There were 81,000 slaves within the temple complex and 240,000 head of cattle. It's just massive. It's beyond belief. Every time I hear Karnak, in fact, Brad and I laughed about the Johnny Carson caricature that he did of Karnak the Great with a Ottoman turban and a great feather and some gaudy jewel in the center of the turban. After having visited Karnak, if Johnny Carson wanted to portray the greatest of the great leaders of the ancient world, he certainly chose Karnak as an appropriate symbol. It's difficult to explain the layout of Karnak. It's built on a double axis which crosses at a central courtyard, but you pass through one pylon after another. There are 9 of them in a row into each different dynasty's temples and colossi and statues and so on. It's just one amazing sight after another. The second day in Luxor, we took a tour to the other side of the Nile, across the Nile from Luxor to the Theban necropolis. We went with a local tour guide whose card hypes himself as an Egyptologist, and in fact he had quite substantial knowledge. The Theban necropolis on the other side is actually a number of valleys which testify to the obsession with death and resurrection that produced the pyramids in Cairo. These pharaoh rulers were mindful of how they'd failed to protect the mummies of the old kingdom pharaohs, so they built their new temples, dug them actually into the mountains of the Theban hills, sinking their tombs actually below ground level in these arid valleys and plains. It was an all-day tour. We left early in the morning. A car came to pick us up about 8 o'clock in the morning at our hotel. And then we gathered with some other tourists and took a boat across the Nile and began what was a fascinating journey into the past. We began with a visit to a spot called Deir al-Bahri, which means Northern Monastery. It's exactly across the river from the temples at Karnak and is in a natural amphitheater in the Theban hills. It is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. I could never pronounce her name, but she was the only woman to rule over Egypt as a pharaoh from 1503 to 1482 BC. The guide told us that she was always dressed in disguise as a man for the general masses' sake, whereas everybody who was anybody knew that in fact she was a woman. We visited the Valley of the Kings, which is set in the bone-dry Theban hills, and in fact remote from the other parts of the necropolis. These were the secretive tombs of about 120 pharaohs of the New Kingdom that were built here to protect them from grave robbers. We visited a couple of tombs, most particularly the tomb of Ramses VI, which has recently been open to tourists. And to enter it, you walk down a long, long ramp that goes down deep into the earth. The whole long hallway or ramp that leads down to the main tomb site was decorated with beautiful paintings. It was in front of the Ramses VI tomb that the tomb of Tutankhamun was found. The entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb had been buried in rubble that was tossed off during the excavation of Ramses VI temple, which is why the temple of Tutankhamun was protected and not discovered for so many years. From the Valley of the Kings, we traveled to the Valley of the Queens, passing through a village of Deir el-Medina, which is known as the workmen's village, that housed the masons and the painters and the sculptors who created the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The village itself isn't of any interest. It's another miserable village without water, in fact. The guide told us that the Egyptian government is working diligently to move the people from this miserable village into better housing nearer to schools and so on. But the locals are reluctant to move because while they have no obvious source of income, their real money is made from searching the hills of the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens and stealing things from the various tombs that they find. Things they get there before the archaeologists do, break open the tombs and take whatever they can and sell it. The Valley of the Queens is actually a bit of a misnomer. It contains 80 tombs, again in the arid hills on the opposite side of the Nile from Luxor. The tombs are not only of queens, although there are many queens there, but the tombs also are honoring high officials and royal children. Because of polygamy and concubines amongst the royalty of the later dynasties, they produced large families, huge broods, whose bloodlines were further entangled by the fact that crown princes often married their sisters. It's in this Valley of the Queens that this exquisite tomb of Nefertiti, the wife of Ramses II, has been fully restored. However, it's closed to the public because they are very concerned about the breadth of the many tourists that might come through, actually damaging some of the paintings on the walls. They are experimenting. Egyptian and Egyptologists are experimenting with a number of different ways to preserve these tombs. In one of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings that we went to, the paintings are actually covered with glass, which stands out from the paintings maybe an inch, held up by wooden and steel pegs held off the wall. They're experimenting over a period of several years to see if this actually prevents the breath of the many tourists from producing so much humidity that the paintings are disintegrated. Returning from the Valley of the Kings towards the Nile, we passed the road goes right past the Colossus of Memnon, this gigantic pair of enthroned statues. They rise nearly 60 feet above the fields. They were originally in front of a mortuary temple, but later pharaohs took all the masonry from the temples to build their own temples. So there's really nothing remaining here except the king's colossi. They have worn terribly. Both have lost their faces and their crowns, and have been cracked by an earthquake. And in fact, at one point, when the Nile used to flood before they built the dams, the temples, these two colossi, were actually underwater for periods of time. Traveling around the necropolis area, we saw a number of little villages, in addition to the one I just mentioned, but they were primarily mud brick houses, and people live at an appallingly desperate situation. I saw a quote in a paper that the average monthly income for a family of 9 people doesn't go much above 200 Egyptian pounds, which is roughly about $50 to $80 a month. The people out in the farms in the rural areas are really in desperate condition. From Luxor, we, after having visited the necropolis all morning, we headed to the train station. The train was supposed to come in at 4, leave at 4:30 for Aswan. Of course, it didn't arrive until 5:30, almost 6 o'clock. Most of the passengers that come on this train from Cairo get off in Luxor because it's such a terrible trip. That's as much as they can do. So there was no problem just walking on the train. The 5-hour trip to Aswan actually took 6 hours, and was the train car was crummier, less comfortable than the second class one that we ridden in from Cairo, but it was a second class car. The people that were on this train from Cairo, still on the train, had been on the train for 15, 16 hours, and they were absolutely blasted. But in any case, the trip only cost us a few dollars. And we arrived in Aswan in the evening, about 9 o'clock in the evening. And I loved Aswan. It was very, very beautiful. It is Egypt's southernmost city. It's an ancient frontier town and has a lovely setting on the Nile. At the Nile, the deserts are actually very close to the river. There's only a very thin line of green that lines the edges of the river. The primary people living in Aswan are Nubians. They were actually the original desert tribes of this area, and have some of them migrated with the establishment of the borders between Egypt and Sudan. Some migrated to Sudan, some went north actually into Upper Egypt, and the majority of them, though, have stayed here around Aswan. They are smaller and darker than the Arab Egyptians, but they have very much an innate dignity, and they were very, very kind people. When Brad and I got off the train late in the evening, we both had only as much luggage as we could carry. So we took a taxi into the central part of town along the Corniche, running along the Nile. I had a list of hotels from my guidebook, and we stopped at a number of them. And although they realized that we only wanted to look at the rooms, we rejected 2 hotels as not being clean enough, and settled for the Happy Hotel, HAPPI, about a block off the Corniche, with wonderful rooftop restaurant overlooking the Elephantine Island and the Nile. Again, Brad was able to negotiate a price of $10 a night for the 2 of us, mother and son, and we carried on with our charade. Aswan is a shopper's paradise. The local market, which we were just on one side street adjacent to the main street of the market, runs for blocks and blocks and blocks, and there are goods there from everywhere. Certainly all of the touristic stuff that we saw in Cairo and then in Luxor. But in addition, there are a number of very fine items from Africa, other places in Africa that appear in this market. It's also a food market, but the whole marketplace is a mixture of food stalls and spices, and then the touristic area with clothing and the usual schlock, all combined to make it's open until about midnight and crammed actually until about that time. Because the weather was warm and we were there for a short period. Brad and I did a lot of rambling through this market. I bought a couple of things there too, which I'll show and tell when I come home. The Nubians have a reputation for being honest and reliable, which was a delight for the tourists. In fact, about 85% of the Nubian men in Aswan make their living from tourism. On the Elephantine Island, which is directly across from the main downtown Aswan, there are a couple of Nubian villages where the houses are painted in bright colors, yellows and pinks and turquoise, set amongst a forest of palm trees, date palms. And while foreigners are tolerated in the village, they, in fact, are not encouraged to come and wander through there, as the Nubians, in fact, still live a very family-oriented, traditional lifestyle. The Nubians, by the way, still speak their own language. One of the days of our stay in Aswan, Bradley opted to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and take the 6-hour ride across the desert to Abu Simbel, where I chose instead to poke around Aswan itself and paid too much for a taxi to take me out to the Aswan High Dam, and spent a couple hours out there looking around. Abu Simbel is the temple of Ramses II that was moved